Much advice is given on relationships, yet most of them are either dissatisfying, shallow, dysfunctional, mutually depressive, or downright abusive. The people around us and the kind of connections we form with them make up a significant part of our quality of life, and thus focusing on them can yield impressive results. This applies doubly to us who seek to grow radically, exponentially, dare I say valiantly, in both life skills and self-knowledge. The people around you can give you wings, or they can tie an anchor to your neck when it comes to this process. Those around who prefer comfort and dissociation to growth and connection will fight doggedly to stunt your growth, be it actively or through withdrawing approval and deflating your ambitions. It's no wonder that growth seekers often make their early grade breakthroughs in solitude, away from their social circles. On the flip side, being surrounded by purposeful and courageous people will inspire your own development in amazing ways. Either way, this is a key issue where there's a great deal of confusion in today's mainstream thinking because two core principles, not accidentally, are ignored. Welcome to the Valiant Growth Podcast. I'm your host Philip Frey, and today I will be talking about the first core principle of human connections: adult relationships are voluntary. So let me begin by clarifying two things. The first one is that many of our interactions are not voluntary. Paying taxes is not a choice. We also have to deal with disorganized crime when out and about in the world. Many people are victims or perpetrators of abuse within adult romantic and familiar relationships. There's also fraud. Many profit from misleading us, which by definition is not a voluntary relationship. What this principle says is that adult relationships are rightfully voluntary. They are meant to be voluntary if they are to be healthy. The second thing is that children to adult relationships within families are not voluntary by their very nature. As I first heard Stefan Molyneux put it, children are biological prisoners, insofar as they depend on their parents to get their most basic and also all needs met. Until a level of self-sufficiency is reached, they cannot leave, and thus there is no voluntarism in the relationship. This doesn't mean that these relationships are inherently bad, but it does mean that through the act of creating a life that is fully dependent on them, parents automatically assume full moral responsibility for getting their children's needs met. As such, though they can leave and do leave their children, they can do it without massive damage to their integrity and thus their self-esteem, and without seriously compromising their ability to develop empathy and grow in the future. And this applies equally to parents who don't abandon their children outright, but who are neglectful or abusive. It's hard enough for victims to recognize their victimhood. Abusers recognizing their abuse is a very difficult and very unusual process. So what are the implications of this principle, and why is it important? Well, here's the thing. You don't owe anything to anyone where you didn't enter that relationship voluntarily. So say if I sign a contract that I will pay you X dollars a month for a car, that is a voluntary transaction and I rightfully owe you that money. But if I never did that and never even made the promise, then you coming up to me and asking for the dollars has no basis to it. And the most radical and most immediate application of this is in the case of parents. There is a lot of conditioning in culture preparing you to be forever grateful and eternally servile to your parents. But if you think about it logically, this obligation has no basis. And I know that this will sound pretty extreme to some of you, but hear me out. You've made no choice to be born. You made no choice insofar as which family you will belong to. Those choices were made by your parents, and as I said, because they created a being they chose to create a being that is fully dependent on them, they bear full moral responsibility for getting your needs met. There is no such obligation the other way around. And again, I know this might sound radical, but all the support and all the attention and all the nurturing and all the resources that you've received up to the point where you can be considered an adult by your parents was their duty, and you don't even fundamentally owe a thanks for it. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you don't owe it. Extending this further, you also don't owe anything to your government or your country. You didn't choose where to be born, and you also didn't choose to live in a world where almost all of the habitable territory is currently occupied by governments. So the people telling you how you're supposed to do this and that for your country, or you're supposed to be loyal to the government, there is no basis for that. You have made no choice in this relationship as an adult, and thus you have no obligations to pay taxes, to serve in the military, to wave the flag and sing the hymn. You can choose to do all of this, of course, but there's no logical way of saying that you are wrong if you don't, and that you should do it. This also applies to whatever community you were born into and whatever religious group you were born into. Same principle. Unless you chose it as an adult, you cannot be held to any kind of obligations within it. Now, you may very well love your community or love your church, and there's nothing wrong with that. They often are excellent support networks, but nobody can tell you that you, by default, owe this or that to this or that community. That is wrong. Same goes for your company. You've entered a relationship voluntarily, and you are absolutely bound to stay within the contractual agreement, but you have no obligations beyond that. And companies demanding loyalty and obedience and sacrifice above and beyond what you agreed to when you signed up are basically just trying to scam you. So in essence, and this is a Randian concept, you are not meant to sacrifice your life, your resources, your happiness for anyone or anything. In fact, anyone worth anything will not ask you to do that. And this applies to relationships as well. This applies even to small things, even to time given to people. You don't owe anybody your time, your attention, your affection, your caring. And the moment you realize that is when you can give them out most freely to the people who deserve it. And let me stress it again, that in the case of parents, because it's not a voluntary relationship, you do owe to meet all of your children's needs. But in adult-to-adult relationships, that is not the case. And this can be a very liberating thought, because nothing good, or we might say nothing great, ever comes out of obedience and servitude. And not only is it not logical and unfounded, but you will never have good relationships with people who are trying to impose an obligation on you that you have never chosen in the first place. And once you get rid of that, your relationships will see a significant improvement. And what this principle implies is not to abandon all these people necessarily, but to take all of your relationships, including the sacred cows of family and community and all of that, and reassess them neutrally. Reassess them without the propaganda that is often inflicted, especially on children, but that is omnipresent in society when it comes to many forms of relationships. Reassess them from a neutral point of view and ask yourself this: am I getting value from this relationship? Are my needs being met in this relationship? Is my time well spent in this relationship? How do I feel when I interact with this person? How do I feel when I see their names on the phone? How do I feel when I'm about to knock on their doors? Take an inventory of all your relationships and take action where you see them to be unfit. If people are trying to impose unchosen obligations on you, bring it up in the relationship and see what happens. Bring it up respectfully. They themselves have been subjected to the same propaganda as you, and it might be that a ray of truth will make them realize the error of their way and repent for their mistake and apologize for imposing things upon you. And if that happens, that will put the relationship on a more equal footing, and the chance that it becomes rewarding, exciting, and healthy will increase significantly. And if they double down, you might have to reassess the viability of this relationship. And as with everything, if you're not in a relationship that's directly dangerous or abusive to you, and that you have to break suddenly and violently, if that's not the case, I urge you to be gentle with people. Maybe even risk being vulnerable. Because these are very radical ideas. These are very new ideas in some ways. And they will be shocking to those on the receiving end. And you might want to accommodate for this fact. And here's the really amazing thing. The more open you are and the more vulnerable you are, the more truth you will find out about them. People's reaction to vulnerability is a key indicator of who they are and if you can trust them to be part of your support network, because sooner or later you will be vulnerable anyways. And if these are people who respect that and empathize with that, they'll be great allies. But if these are people who abuse that and disrespect that in general, they are a very risky asset to have in your portfolio of relationships. I've decided to split this podcast into 2 parts. I believe that I've given enough food for thought for today, and the next time I will be talking about the second core principle of healthy relationships that will really liberate you and, in the long term, really improve the quality of your social circle. If you find this podcast valuable and you'd like to contribute, I ask you to help it grow. We're in a very early phase at this point, and building reach is strategically the most important thing at this phase. Something great that you can do is go like the Valiant Growth Facebook page. Just search Valiant Growth or type facebook.com/valiantgrowth into your browser. And also, if you really want to help out, invite your friends that might be interested in this show, who will also find value in it. That really helps with the reach, and I would be very grateful for that. Thank you for listening to the Valiant Growth podcast, and I dare you to flourish today.